There's not enough men's circles and women's circles. There's not enough men, friends with men, telling each other the same stories over and over again, and women really sitting around in women's circles and doing their own thing. For some reason, over the last few decades, men and women have been programmed through like big romance and just like the fake kind of rom-com stuff that goes on with these movies, that like you can get everything you need from this one other person. That's just not true. Hey everybody, welcome back to another episode of Ancient Intelligence. This is part 2 of the biggest difference between men and women. So if you haven't listened to or watched part 1, I suggest you go back and do that. I get into the big difference between men and women and how all of the things that we misunderstand about each other really stems from this one big difference. And I'm not going to leave a cliffhanger here, right? I'm going to go ahead and tell you it's the fact that men have singular focus and the fact that women have diffused focus. And this all goes back to our evolutionary psychology as hunters and gatherers. And so in the first video, I talk all about that, go into deep detail around what that means, how that works, and what are the results of that, and how in modern times, how we can see that happening in our lives day to day, and how we misunderstand each other in a couple of different ways. So I suggest you check that out. But here for part 2, what I really want to do is I want to double click into one significant difference that has been a aha and just like a amazing, funny, beautiful, and just like endearing difference that I have found about men and women based on this difference that we have as hunters versus gatherers. So quick little recap, okay? The hunter has singular focus because if you think about his purpose and his mission in his life, it's all about to achieve a result by bringing back the game, hunt the game. What does he need to do when he hunts the game? He has to be completely focused. He has to cut out all of the periphery distractions, emotions, feelings, conversations. He has to just be locked in, right? And that really has evolved in the way that a man thinks about life and the world and what he does and conversations and listening and connections and relationships. Whereas the woman, the gatherer, her mission, her purpose really is to keep the tribe connected, is to stay connected, to nurture the tribe. And so she goes out and she gathers the ripe berries. She makes sure she doesn't touch the poisonous ones. She makes sure that she is in deep communion with all of the other gatherers so that they're working together to gather what they need for the success of the tribe, right? Very different ways of seeing the world, very different ways of living, of thinking, right? So based on those two differences, singular versus diffuse, everything can kind of ladder back up to that difference. The way we communicate, what we're looking for when we communicate, how we see planning, how we see everything, right? And so one of the biggest, most fun differences that has just like kind of struck me, and I actually wrote an essay about this, so I'm going to reference this essay, is this notion that we tell stories for a completely different purpose, right? Imagine if someone is doing something and you believe that the purpose of the thing that they're doing is one way, and they believe the purpose of the thing that they're doing is a completely different purpose. You would then, without knowing what their purpose is, you might think they're wrong, right? And so that's exactly what's been going on with women, with men and women, with in regards to storytelling. I think this is such a funny blind spot, and I'm kind of making it humorous because it is one of those things we can really take lightly, and we can kind of laugh about and love and kind of just make this a little more light. And sometimes these conversations about sexes and men and women get so intense, and it's just mostly it's a little harmless, but it's so beautiful once we understand. So here's the thing: men tell stories for entertainment, but women tell stories for information. So last week I was sitting with a group of friends, okay? And it was a married couple, some single folks. And one of the women was like, oh, I wanted to tell you about XYZ. Have I told you that story? And I said, yes, you have. I've heard that one. And then she got quiet. That was it. We were about to move on. But then her husband said, wait, babe, I love that story. You should tell it. And we looked at each other like a little like, oh, I don't know what to do. This is it. The difference. Men love to tell the same stories over and over again. They really do. If you think about this, like, oh, getting together with your war buddies and like talking about the war stories, like we've heard all of that stuff before. Women actually hate repeating stories. And I found myself with women always asking the similar question, like, wait, did I tell you that already? If I did, let's move on. Men don't really do that. And it's because they have a fundamentally different reason for telling a story than a woman does. And so physiologically, we do this because we're different, and men tell stories based on the hunter and the singular focus, and women tell stories based on the gatherer and the diffused focus and what she needs, right? So if you think about a story like a hunt, like it's the story of the hunt. Think about a hunter, bring him up in your mind. What does it take to have a successful hunt, right? He's got to train, he's got to like perfect the skills, a lot of repetition, a lot of focus, like a lot of bravery, a lot of determination. Men do really hard shit. Like men do really hard shit in life. They've always been the ones that have to do the hardest things. And they're so singularly focused in that because they know the survival of the tribe depends on them. It really does. It depends on them. It's like do or die, right? Lots of pressure. I know that men are actually more fulfilled in life when they have this pressure because it really helps them thrive. That competition, it's like we see it, and we see it now today. It's like so many men, they're just so apathetic, and there's such a sedation going on with so many people because there's not that like communal competitive, like pressure filled thing. And so basically, that's kind of like the pre-hunt, right? And then you think about the actual hunt where he catches the boar or the deer or like he wins the battle. There's so much intensity. And then he comes back and he's excited and grateful and just, so much buildup, so much pressure, so much intensity. And then he comes back. What happens when the hunter comes back from the hunt or the warrior comes back from battle? Like, what happens? I had asked myself this question many times. And then I was like, oh, the story of the hunt. Duh, of course. If you've seen like Braveheart or Viking movies, like when the men come back, there's always like, I can think of that scene in Braveheart actually when the friend is like, oh, and then he ducked and then he hit this way and then his sword went flying. And then, right, he's like, one of the guys is telling the story of the hunt. Everyone in the village gathers. They listen to the men recount the action, right? They may embellish some parts, they may deprioritize others, right? So why are they doing this? They're provisionally entertaining the people. They're entertaining. This story that they're telling is like, it's such entertainment because it like showcases their heroism. It gives so many other benefits, right? Too. Think about like, this is something that I heard from Allison Armstrong too at some point, like this idea that maybe even the men on the sidelines, maybe not the MVP was telling the story, but the men were there. Maybe they played more supportive roles, but they got to watch it all go down. Retelling the story makes them feel like they're a part of it. Like they were accountable for this thing, this big feat that happened, right? Monumental thing. So also what happens during the retelling of the story of the hunt, the testosterone levels rise. It puts them kind of right back in that moment of action, and it just like floods them with this like very amped up feeling. And so if you think about like why this would matter for survival, it's a reminder of like what it feels like to win big, to hunt big, all that. So it inspires that courage and bravery, and it gets men excited for the next one. It's like, oh, I'm going to be the MVP in the next one, right? So all of that to say, telling that same monumental story, it builds accountability for men. It raises testosterone levels. It encourages men. It creates camaraderie between men. They tell stories for entertainment, moments of glory. The need to tell these stories is like evolutionary evolutionarily built into men so they don't lose sight of the mission. This blew my mind when I first started to really understand it. I was telling another friend this, and she was telling me that she was leaving church with her and her husband, and then she stopped to have a conversation with another woman, and they had the same situation go down. She said something like, "Oh, da da da, have I told you this already?" Or no, sorry, it was the husband that said something, like he was about to say something, and then the wife said, "Oh, she knows this." And then he proceeded to tell the same story after the cue of, "Wait, we've already told this story, right?" That's a female cue. That's a gatherer cue. Like, we've already told this story. We don't need to tell it again. For a man, that doesn't register because he wants to tell the same story over and over again. If it makes him feel good, if it makes him feel positive and uplifted, because stories are for entertainment. It's not a cue for the gatherer. Okay, let's move on to the story of gathering, right? So the gatherer gathers. She gathers information in addition to the berries and the nuts, right? For her, telling stories are about gathering as much information as possible. So if you think about, for a man, the question is what's the big thing, or what's the point? What's the one thing that happened? For a woman is what else happened? What's next? What's the next thing? What about, now, right? Bringing up an image of a gatherer in your mind, think about this seer, this visionary woman. She's the emotional glue of the tribe. You really think about that. The man's out there bringing home the game. He's out there singularly focused all day. Who holds the tribe together? It's the woman. She's the one. And so if you think about what she's spending most of her time doing, she's gathering and she's holding everyone together. She's essentially, if you think about it, what would be a really important skill to have? Deciphering which berries are ripe, which ones are good for eating, which ones are poisonous, knowing what leaves to touch, what not, and collecting every bit of detail, right? Every bit of detail she can to the best of her ability to keep the women constantly informed, right? It's all about healing people, not killing them. So she's got to keep up with every last plant growing in the village. She's got to be keenly aware of nuances in facial expressions and behaviors of everyone around her. She's got to be so tuned in to people that she can put a stop to any potential conflicts before they arise, right? Emotionally, she's got to have a lot of detailed information, and she's having a lot of conversations. We know this. Women speak 10x the amount of words that men do each day. In the world of the gatherer, relationships are always shifting and the seasons are always changing. Leaves are turning colors. Berries are different next month than they are this month. There's a lot of respect and admiration. So it's all about the gatherers are all about sensing things and intuitively and quickly telling that information to the other gatherers. So what ends up coming up in this type of environment is that by telling someone something they already know, it's kind of rude. It's just offensive. It's not done. You're making someone feel like they aren't as ahead of the game as you, right? They're not on the nose of the most changing seasonal thing. And so it's so funny, but for the hunter, it's so rude to cut him off when he's telling a story because he's doing it for entertainment. Whereas for her, it's just so not done. Women really don't retell stories to each other. We want the next thing, the new bit of information. What's the next thing that you're feeling? What's your emotional state right now, not then? It's really freaking fascinating. I think it's just amazing. Just going back to that experience where the woman's husband was retelling that same story, the two women were looking at each other like, what is this man doing? What is this man doing? And just take a moment for that. And there's just some detail around the story of the hunt versus the story of the gatherer. Such different purposes for storytelling, entertainment versus information. And if you think about it, this would make sense why so many women in corporate America and corporate world all over the place think that men are mansplaining, right? I actually Googled it, and it's defined on the internet like this: explaining something to a woman in a condescending way that assumes she has no knowledge about the topic. Okay, this is funny now, right? Because it just explains the misunderstandings. Okay, listen, I'm certain there are plenty of men that like have big egos and just find lots of joy in belittling people. Great. There's a few, but not most men. Most men are literally just looking to tell the story of the hunt to anyone who will listen. They want some validation. They want a testosterone boost. Evolutionarily, that's built into their system. They want an opportunity to provide a lesson, sharing something they know well, sharing a glory moment, sharing something they've experienced. But most women don't get that, right? Now that you know the story of gathering, most women don't understand the positive excitement and positive flow of life that men feel from repeating stories. So what do they assume? They assume that what the gatherer assumes. They assume that men think they're stupid and are insulting their intelligence, right? Why are you telling me that again? Like, why are you telling me that? I know that, right? And if gatherers don't repeat stories, then it would make sense why women are becoming so offended by that. So women are just thinking that men think that she's stupid and needs to be told the same thing over and over again. She interprets this as condescending, and boom, she calls it mansplaining. Meanwhile, he's told many men the same story over and over again, and they don't take it that way because they understand, mostly subconsciously, right? A lot of this stuff is happening subconsciously. It's like my friend's husband in the beginning of this episode, babe, I love that story, tell it again, right? Or the other man that just like wanted to tell the story even though he heard that they had said it, but they had said it before. It's just so interesting. Whereas with women, we're just a little bit different. So, like, I have a beautiful relationship with this woman who lives in Europe, and we have a lot of audio messages back and forth. She's like one of the most enriching souls in my life. And I can tell you, not one time in the years of audio messages back and forth that are very long, 10 minutes sometimes, 12 minutes, not one story has ever been repeated, because it's like, remember when I told you that about that one thing then? Okay, well, right now, what I feel about it is, right? That's how women are. That's how we behave. It's like, what's the latest information? What's the most current of how you're feeling? How can I relate to your emotions right this second? How can I be connected to you right now? As opposed to for men, it's like, how can we pull back that glory moment? How can we really like make light of and reinterpret this exciting thing that happened? Let me retell the story. So interesting. Big takeaway. Why this is so frustrating for people these days? There's not enough same-sex gathering. There's not enough men's circles and women's circles. There's not enough men friends with men telling each other the same stories over and over again, like war buddies, but in the modern sense, and women really sitting around in women's circles and doing their own thing, right? Just generally speaking, for some reason, over the last few decades, men and women have been programmed, I think, through like big romance and just like the fake kind of rom-com stuff that goes on with these movies, that like you can get everything you need from this one other person. That's just not true. Throughout all of history, if you think about especially how tribes live, there's always the men's tent, the women's tent, the same-sex gathering that happens where these types of things are respected and understood. And yes, we can understand them, right? As we start to understand this information and the difference between singular and diffused focus, but it's also about just like that same-sex gathering. And so that's number one. Number two, yeah, just really understanding each other, right? And I kind of want to finish here with a little story. So I've said a lot, especially about this men tell stories for entertainment and women tell stories for information. And mind you, this is just one little branch of difference off of that root difference that is singular versus diffused focus. So in that first video, I have a whole bunch of great examples. This one, I wanted to zero in on one. There are so many, and I can't wait to keep learning about them and getting more and more curious. It's so much fun. But I will end with a bit of a story that can help us create some empathy within this. So a friend of mine, she was saying to me that she was upset. Her ex-husband hadn't come to visit her daughter in a long time. He came by, and all he did was talk about himself. He talked about college football, and he told the same story that he's told a whole bunch of times from when he was playing college football. And she was just like, why is he so selfish? He never asks about her. Every time he comes and goes, she's always left feeling like he didn't really ask much about her, his daughter. And I know the story of this man. He's had lots of setbacks, since college, and he's no longer with them, right? There's a lot to say about that. He doesn't have that much going for her. And so his instinct, that evolutionary psychology, had him pull back for the story that paints him in the best light, his glory days. He thinks maybe this story will help his daughter see that maybe he's not that big of a loser, or he's not doing as badly as he is, right? She heard that and she just started crying, and she just understood a little better. There's not enough men's circles and women's circles. There's not enough men, friends with men, telling each other the same stories over and over again, like war buddies, but in the modern sense, and women really sitting around in women's circles and doing their own thing, right? Just generally speaking, for some reason, over the last few decades, men and women have been programmed, I think, through like big romance and just like the fake kind of rom-com stuff that goes on with these movies, that like you can get everything you need from this one other person. That's just not true. Throughout all of history, if you think about especially how tribes live, there's always the men's tent, the women's tent, the same-sex gathering that happens where these types of things are respected and understood. And until the next one. Hello, everybody. You got your host, Anya Shack here, and I hope you've enjoyed this episode. I am so excited to be here and sharing my wisdom, my truths, all the research I do, from pop culture to science to evolutionary psych, to really come together and bring y'all the information that men and women really need to understand themselves better and to understand what the other needs better. This is my mission. This is something I'm so passionate about. So if you've gotten some value from this episode, please, please, please share it with someone you know. This helps me grow the podcast, and that is exactly what I intend to do this year. Sending y'all so much love.